Now, prisons are to be closed. 3 prisons, indeed, with a total capacity of 850 inmates. The Ministry of Justice has announced Ashwell Prison in Rutland, Lancaster Castle in Lancashire will shut, whilst Morton Hall in Lincolnshire changes to an immigration removal centre. The Justice Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, wants to cut total inmate numbers, said the jails were outdated and expensive. As of last weekend, the jail population in England and Wales was 82,991, almost 5,000 places below capacity. The inmates from the 3 closed prisons will be rehoused elsewhere, whilst about 500 staff will be transferred nearby or invited to apply for voluntary redundancy. Mr. Clarke said the decision to close any prison is a difficult one, but one that we've had to make. Closing outdated and expensive prisons is an important step in our strategy to provide a secure and modern, fit-for-purpose prison estate while improving efficiency and value for the taxpayer. In December, Mr. Clarke set out proposals to reduce the then 85,000 strong prison population in England and Wales by about 3,000 over 4 years. So not exactly a revolutionary change, but nonetheless change deeply unpopular with my first guest, who's a man who has the benefit of being clear in his opinions and an all-round broadcaster and Renaissance man he is too. Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday. Peter, welcome to the show, my friend.
A pleasure to be with you.
Tell me, just summarise, if you would, why you're so cross with Kenneth Clarke's approach to prison affairs.
Well, it's fundamentally dishonest. The people like Mr. Clarke don't really believe in prisons at all. They don't believe in the principle of punishment of responsible persons who've committed crimes. And they only maintain prisons because they believe there's a public demand for them. But deep down, they tend to think, oh, isn't it annoying that the stupid public still persist in believing that we should have places like this? We'd really much rather have most of these people out on community sentences or on probation. Prison is, as far as we're concerned, an expensive waste of time. So they go through the motions. And one of the results of this is, of course, the prisons are totally unconvincing as punitive establishments. It's very difficult to get into one in the first place, unless you commit a crime such as murder, in which case you will go straight to prison. You'll generally have to commit perhaps 20 or 30 crimes and become a serial recidivist before you get into prison. And of course, by that stage, the chances that prison's going to alter your behaviour are pretty slender. And you can then say, having been the liberal who made this happen and filled the prisons with people who were already serial offenders and habitual criminals, well, prison doesn't do any good. Of course it doesn't at that stage. If people encountered prison as a punitive experience very early in their criminal careers, it might change their behaviour. But at the moment it doesn't. The other thing, of course, that's wrong with prison is that, as we saw in the recent troubles at Forward Open Prison, over which the Secretary of State for Justice ought to have resigned, given that we've now discovered that his department was warned in advance that trouble was coming. But given that we've seen what goes on there, the prisons are, to a very large extent, run by their inmates, especially during the hours of darkness. The staff pretty much withdraw. And the fact that we don't have very many prison riots and much prison disturbance is largely down to the fact that the staff have withdrawn, that attempts to control the prisons by the staff have been pretty much abandoned, that the prisoners are bought off with television sets in cells, with a blind eye being turned to the presence of stupefying drugs and indeed alcohol, and every effort really being made to make sure that the prisoners are contented in a sort of way, and that their way of life is not challenged, and that no real effort is made to discipline them or give them the impression that they're under control. And this is cheap, and it avoids trouble, and most of the time they get away with it. And then you have incidents like the one at Ford on New Year's Eve, where it's clear that it isn't actually working in a way that the public would like if they knew about it. But most of the time that's kept behind high walls. One of the fascinating things about so many British prisons is that if you look at them from outside, they still look pretty grim. When you get inside, they're like, the idea that prisons are holiday camps is ludicrous, and people should stop saying it. They're not. You wouldn't want to be in one.
They're ugly, foul-smelling places.
Unpleasant, but largely unpleasant because of the people in them. And you go to Wormwood Scrubs now, there's quite a lot of attractive Victorian architecture cleaned up, and it looks a bit like a university hall of residence. And the rooms you won't have to look quite carefully to realise that they're prison cells. But there's still an awful lot of squalor. Most of it is moral squalor. And as I say, it results from the fact that the prison officers have conceded an awful lot of control to the prisoners. They let them run it, and of course that means the worse you are, the easier an experienced prison will be for you. If you're a violent, ruthless, amoral brute, then prison will suit you fine. If heaven forbid you're an innocent, gentle person who's been locked up by a miscarriage of justice, then I really shudder nightly to think that such people exist.
It's a bleak picture you paint,
It's horrible. It's
Peter,
absolutely
I must
horrible.
say.
It's the worst, worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, well, it's like the inferno as you paint it, and you're not. I'm not suggesting you're wrong either in many important respects, but let me challenge a couple of the points. Just exactly who is not currently being sent to prison ought to be. I mean, which class of offenders?
Well, it's not so much which class of offender, it's at what stage. I think it seems to me that if you, say, break into somebody's house and steal their possessions, then that ought to take you straight to prison. And it doesn't. What will happen is you might have to do it 15 or 20 times before it will take you to prison. And even then, you won't go there for very long. And if you attack,
I'd be with you on that. I think
if you attack somebody with that justification and with severe violence, then again you ought to go straight to prison. I'm afraid that is also no longer the case. The efforts to separate violent from non-violent have faded. So quite a lot of people who commit offences which you and I would regard as quite severely violent now do end up on community sentences. The very interesting report by Policy Exchange recently on community service and on what's happening there now, which everybody who's interested in this should read. It is being used as a sort of fig leaf, and there's a lot of pretense. But the real problem is that it's not just that. An awful lot of crime and disorder now goes on untouched by the criminal justice system altogether. It never gets to court. It never even gets discovered or recorded because the police are not there to record it, and people don't bother to record the police. There are areas of this country, and you'll be familiar with this in your time as a Member of Parliament, particularly the large, badly designed housing estates built in the 50s and 60s, on which people live pretty much untouched by the criminal justice system. What law there is imposed by the local bad people. And that, the authorities and the law and order and justice system simply don't touch them. Any justice system is to some extent street theatre. The idea that all crimes are going to come before the courts has always been a falsehood. But there was, until perhaps 20 years ago, a much stronger relation between the level of crime that was going on and the level of action being taken against it. Now, I think to an awful lot of people, the poorer you are, the worse it is. The criminal justice system is almost completely irrelevant. It doesn't touch their lives at all.
Now, let me ask you, I have before, but it's obviously germane here. You used the phrase an expensive waste of time. Well, it's certainly expensive when you've got the largest prison population in Western Europe. And it's arguably a waste of time for whatever reason. You've made a good case for the reasons as far as you see them, but it's an expensive waste of time if people keep on coming back in, don't they? And we have the highest level of recidivism in Western Europe.
Well, that is, as I say, because the intervention of the system in someone's life who commits crime comes so late that he is already habitually criminal. And also, you really do have to realise this awful calculus where the worse you are, the less of a nasty experience prison is. These people, in many cases, regard prison as a rest and as a perfectly normal career risk, which as rational calculators, and most criminals are entirely rational, they think is a perfectly tolerable interlude in their lives of crime. They're not put off by it. So it's not just wrong in that it arrives in their lives too late. It's wrong in that when it does arrive in their lives, it doesn't seriously inconvenience them or give them any reason to change their behavior. Now, I don't believe in rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation is fundamentally a totalitarian concept. It's about trying to change people's character. I'm not interested in changing people's character. What I am interested in doing is employing the principle of fear, which operates in all serious matters. People don't do things for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they don't do them because of conscience. Sometimes they don't do them because they can't do them. But in many cases, if they're bad things, they don't do them because they're afraid of the consequences. And if you have a serious prison system in which people encounter austerity and the deprivation of the privileges of normal life and a certain amount of humiliation, then they don't want to do it again. And the other thing is that word gets out. One of the important effects of a criminal justice system is not on those who've committed crimes. To some extent, they're already lost causes. But on those who are considering committing crime, is it worthwhile? If word goes round that prison is an unpleasant experience to be avoided, fewer of them will do so. The increase in crime which has taken place in this country, which is unquestionably the case over the past half century, has been among those people who, 50 years ago, would have thought it's not worth it. I'm not going to do this because what will happen to me if I do is, first of all, I'm quite likely to be caught. Secondly, if I am caught, I'm quite likely to be severely punished. And therefore, I won't do it. Now, both those things have largely faded. And so the number of people who are ready to commit crimes goes up. And the more you behave like this, the more impossible it is to contain them with the prison system. The more ineffectual your prisons are, the fuller they will become. Until you can't build any more, you can't build them fast enough or big enough to contain the numbers of people who are committing crimes. But the fault is not just in the number of prisons. The fault is in the way in which they're used and the point at which criminals encounter the hard fist of justice. And if they never encounter that fist, or if they have to wait until they've committed 20 crimes before they do that, then it won't work. And this seems to me to be so obvious that you have to ask, what is the reason why nothing is done about it? And the reason why nothing is done about it is the enormously powerful ideology in our society, which infects, above all, the powerful and the well-off.
Well, again,
an absolute rejection of moral absolutism, an absolute rejection of the idea of right and wrong, a belief that almost all actions are justified by circumstances, that every crime is to be excused by the person's upbringing or conditions, and that therefore you can't punish. So
well, but in the United States, but Peter, in the United States, very few of these conditions obtains. They have a gigantic prison population, one of the very largest in the whole world, and amongst some sections of the U.S. population, for example, African Americans, black Americans, 12% of American black males have been in the prison system. They have a gigantic prison system. They are not trammeled by these soft, woolly, liberal ideas. And yet, you wouldn't argue that the United States is, in any sense, crime-free, would you?
Oh, well, there are so many things to be said about the United States. Some of the things we think about the United States simply aren't true. For instance, you look at the way in which drugs are treated in the United States. The attitude towards cannabis, that very, very dangerous poison, is almost as weak in the United States as it is here, and in some cases even weaker. Cannabis is effectively legal in California, where it's supposedly issued as a medical prescription, for goodness sake. And similar laws have, interestingly enough, just been introduced in Arizona, which voted last November for so-called medical cannabis. And indeed, Pima County, the place where this recent horror has taken place, and in which the alleged culprit is a serial cannabis smoker, is shortly to introduce cannabis dispensaries in the streets where you can legally obtain it for supposed medical grounds. So the American criminal justice system is not as stringent as people think that it is. And the other thing is, the United States is simply not like Britain. It is a hugely different society in so many ways, and one of the things which scars it and will scar it for centuries to come, as anybody who's lived there will tell you, is the legacy of slavery and the awful consequences of that, the very, very deep racial division, which is hidden. It's not, unlike South Africa, the Americans have always been careful to hide the fact that they are a heavily segregated society, and the huge damage done down the generations,
Indeed.
from one to another, by the destruction of family, language, and culture among the people who were snatched from it.
Peter Hitchens, powerful, eloquent, as always, columnist with the Mail on Sunday. Doesn't mean he's right. What's your point of view? 08717 22 33 44. I'll be back after this.